South Africans should welcome the Trump administration's interventions in our country's affairs. Here is why I say that. I've just returned from a trip to Israel where I met with senior government officials from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and I presented a strategic paper outlining the case for Israel to re-engage with South Africa and strengthen its efforts to forge ties across the African continent. The document I presented made a number of key points. Number one, that while Israel has won the military war in the Middle East, South Africa continues to prosecute the ideological war on the global stage, and for this reason, Israel needs to remain engaged with South Africa's people. Number two, that the vast majority of South Africans are conservative Christians who are not aligned with our government's anti-Israel efforts and are therefore natural allies of Israel. And number three, that following the ANC's dramatic loss of support in the 2024 elections, followed by the Trump victory, the balance of forces has shifted in favor of Israel establishing a constructive relationship with South Africa. The Trump administration has transformed global politics. Regarding South Africa, President Trump's recent executive order has made three critical points. The first is that Trump has accused South Africa of, and I quote, reinvigorating its relations with Iran to develop commercial, military, and nuclear arrangements. This poses national security threats to our nation, our allies, our African partners, and our interests. End of quote. These actions of the South African government are even more serious than its actions on behalf of Iran to delegitimize Israel at the ICJ, which are also mentioned in the executive order. What is apparent is the extent to which President Ramaphosa's government is acting against South Africa's national interests by supporting and allying itself with Iran, a violent dictatorship, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, a regime that has common cause with the very jihadi groups actively threatening South Africa's security and that of the entire region. By contrast, Israel can and should be a key economic and security ally for South Africa, helping the entire southern African region defeat the jihadi forces which continue to maim, kill, and terrorize people from Mozambique and across the continent. How can it be in South Africa's national interests to ally with Iran whilst prosecuting Israel at the ICJ? A second point in President Trump's executive order further highlights how President Ramaphosa is acting against the national interests. It is the issue of the new Expropriation Act that allows for the seizure of any fixed or movable property without market-related compensation. This dilution of property rights will increase suffering for millions of the poorest South Africans because without property rights, there won't be investment. And without investment, there won't be economic growth. And without growth, there won't be jobs. The reality is that governments do not generate economic growth. Private investment does. The fixed investment rate for South Africa sits at around 15% of GDP. It needs to be much closer to 25% and ideally 30% for South Africa to reach the levels of economic growth necessary to quickly bring down our very high rate of unemployment. For the past 15 years, South Africa has experienced economic growth at about a quarter of the rate of the average of other emerging markets. Economists estimate that had we maintained the average rate of economic growth of other emerging markets, the unemployment rate in South Africa would be half of what it is today. President Ramaphosa accompanied a delegation of senior business leaders to Davos to promote South Africa as an attractive investment opportunity. Yet the day he returned from Davos, he signed the Expropriation Act that completely undermined everything that the delegation tried to achieve. What the Trump administration is pointing out is actually in South Africa's national interest. Because without economic growth, millions of South Africans are condemned to a life of poverty and suffering. The political and business elite, including the president, the senior leadership of the ANC, and corporate leaders, will always be financially secure. But for ordinary South Africans, this failure to drive economic growth is devastating. The third point made by Mr. Trump is that South Africa will not be a successful country if it discriminates against people on the basis of their race. This does not mean that there should not be empowerment policies that focus on the socioeconomic status of people, but by focusing on race, the South African government taxes investor capital on arrival and drives out many of the country's most skilled people. When you consider Trump's 3 points, that South Africa has allied itself with a murderous terrorist regime, that it's removing the safeguards that investors need to commit capital to the country, and that it severely taxes what capital is committed whilst hounding the most skilled people and entrepreneurs out of the country, you start to understand why the South African economy lags far behind its emerging market peers, and its unemployment rate is more than 6 times higher than the global average. This means that Trump's executive order is directing South Africa to our own national interests. No European government has done this for us. Neither did the Biden administration. Russia and China most certainly do not. Organized business in South Africa is not doing this for us, and the DA is rapidly ceasing to do so as well. The attention South Africa is receiving from the Trump administration is a blessing. It would be far worse for our country if the world's greatest superpower and leading democracy, with its historically unprecedented track record of innovation, prosperity, and success, simply ignored South Africa, dismissing us as irrelevant or a lost cause. Would critics rather have us in the orbit of the EU, with its declining economies and populations, or even worse, in the orbit of the terror regime of Iran and the corrupt dictatorships of Russia and China? President Trump and Elon Musk are both very successful people. By following their advice, South Africa would be too. Musk is one of the greatest business creators of all time, and with his South African roots should be encouraged to help the country of his birth. South Africans should welcome the interventions of the Trump administration because they highlight just how important South Africa remains on the global stage and how much President Trump and Elon Musk must care about our success to actually give attention and effort to our country. But the response to them by the South African elite, political, business, media, who are seldom touched themselves directly by poverty and unemployment, has been snide, superior, and dismissive. The people of South Africa deserve better. The current policies are not working. We need a new way forward. The Talmud teaches that the path to healing and renewal begins with the ability to hear criticism, no matter where it comes from, and to learn from it. But by pursuing policies that ally South Africa with the tyrannies of the world, policies that exacerbate poverty and unemployment, President Ramaphosa is in breach of his most basic constitutional duty, which is, as stated in Chapter 5, Section 222 of the Constitution, and I quote, to advance the Republic. Advancing the Republic means protecting the national interests. This is the very essence of great leadership. At this moment in South African history, we are reminded of a passage from the Book of Kings. When King Solomon passed away, his son Rehoboam became king. Early in his reign, the people approached him with a plea to reduce their burdens, lower taxes, and ease the crushing weight of the state. Seeking guidance, Rehoboam turned to the elders who told him, and I quote, "If today you become a servant to the people and serve them and respond favorably to them and speak kind words to them, they will serve you forever." But Rehoboam rejected their advice, and the kingdom was torn apart. The Talmud distills a simple lesson from this episode. Lo srara ani noten lachem ela avdut. True leadership is about service, not power. The purpose of government is to serve the interests of the people. Personal agendas have no place. And this is the South African government's fundamental mistake. Whether it is Israel, Iran, property expropriation, or racial economic policies, these issues are being driven either by ideological agendas or the financial interests of the ruling elite. None of these actions serve our national interests. The Trump administration's interventions present an historic opportunity to truly create a better life for all South Africans.